Okay, hey guys, so let's talk a little bit more about sharpening and also in a historical context. So, a lot of swords don't have a secondary bevel. They go all the way, the grind follows all the way down. Like you might have a Type 15 that is, has that diamond cross section, and that diamond comes all the way to, a single edge without any kind of secondary grind on it. But actually, what you end up seeing with that is that will have a little bit of a convex edge on there, where it's slightly curved. And when you sharpen something with a convex edge on it, what happens is, and that means it's curved or has an arch shape, is that bevel, instead of being a harsh angle to it, that bevel is a gradual curve that blends back into the uniform geometry of the sword. So some swords, people say they don't have a secondary bevel on them. They actually do, but it's because it's a curved apple seed or convex edge on it that they don't recognize it as a secondary bevel. Like when I put convex edges on the knives that I have them on, and even on a couple of swords that I put them on, you can't really see it unless you've ground it to a different polishing level. As long as the polishing level is the same as the rest of the sword, there's no angle to catch the light there differently. It's a gradual transition. So that's one thing. There definitely are swords that have no secondary bevel, but a lot of them do. They're just not V grinds. They're convex grinds. So you see that a lot. Convex grinds require a little more craftsmanship and a little more skill to make, and are a little hard to do in kind of more rustic field conditions. So if you got a full army and you've got people there specifically to maintain and sharpen weapons, they can probably do that. But say you have a small group of guerrilla fighters out in an extended type of fighting situation that are sharpening their swords themselves, they're probably going to go to more of a V grind. Another thing to keep in mind when people talk about sharpness and all this is that your angle can be more acute or more obtuse. It can be wider or it can be narrower. And the actual edge thinness at the point, how sharp it actually is, could be the same for both of those. The one is definitely going to slice better than the other, and one is going to be more robust and protective. So, there's more to sharpness than just how thin does the blade get. It's what is the angle the sharpening is done at, whether it's the initial geometry going all the way down to the fine edge or a secondary bevel put on it. Is it convex? Is it a V grind? And that gets more complicated because you can have a sword that has a convex edge and then somebody puts a V grind for the final secondary bevel on it. If you buy expensive knives that have convex edges and you do this, you will drive everybody on the internet that collects those kind of knives crazy. So if you really want to rage bait people, you can do this. And you can do the opposite. You can take a regular V-edge geometry on a blade, and you can put a convex bevel on the very end of it to give it a little more strength there. Even if you give it a secondary V-grind bevel, that also gives it more resistance to chipping and grinding. So you'll hear people say all kind of things about it makes the sword less sharp, it won't perform as well, and that's not really true. And in a modern context, putting a bevel on your sword just makes it so much easier to resharpen it, especially if you're cutting with it a lot. And, a lot of my katana have little micro V-grind bevels on them. Now, if you have, an antique sword, or you have a super high-end, expensive sword with a really high-end polish, I can understand that you don't want to put a secondary bevel on. And that's certainly the traditional thing with Japanese swords, where you're polishing the whole thing. But if you insist on not using a secondary bevel with any sort of sword, what you're saying is that you're going to have to remove material from the entire side of the sword, okay, to create a new edge if the sword gets too dull. Okay, that's the only way you can do that. And that's why with Japanese blades, people seem to care so much about having high hardness edges, is because they want the sword to stay as sharp as possible for as long as possible. Because, at least in a modern context, I don't know how expensive it was to get a sword repolished in ancient times, but in modern times, getting a professional polishing job is wildly expensive. It's probably, getting a katana length blade done at a really professional level is probably more as expensive as the most expensive sword I own. Just getting that done on like a high-end Japanese blade. And, like I said, I can understand why you would want to be reluctant with those kind of blades to do that. But even, like a $400 or $500 katana, especially if it's a through-tempered blade that isn't differentially hardened, it isn't sanmai, it's not made out of or shigane or tamahagane or some other type of exotic steel lamination where you have a fancy polish that you're trying to show off, there's really no practical reason not to put a secondary bevel on it, in my opinion. So that's something to consider when you're thinking about that. That sharpening is a lot more complex, and historical blades with that too, than just were they super sharp or were they super dull? Because you see people argue about that as well. And even when you talk about apple seed edges, or as the Japanese say with niku, or convex edges, as I like to say, because I think that's just more accurate. Where it curves, it could have a lot of convex at the top and then make a more acute curve at the bottom, or it could be the opposite. So that curves can have all kind of different, they don't have to be uniform, even curves. So, curving geometry gets really complicated when you're thinking about how you vary that in sword geometry. So you can get into a lot of complexity with that. And so while we're talking about that, let's talk about historical sword sharpness. So were they razor sharp or were they duller? The answer is yeah. And people will talk about, well, in this time period they were duller because they used armor. And yeah and no, I think, because I think, there's a ton of variation. Just like people today, people have different opinions and attitudes about that, and it wouldn't have been a uniform thing. Some people want their swords extremely sharp, and some people will want them less sharp and have a more robust type of edge. But another thing to think about is a lot of these professional warriors in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance and were higher class people that had a certain level of wealth. And they did, it wasn't like a sword was some rare treasure and they just owned one of them. So, a knight in, the high or late Middle Ages would probably own multiple swords. And the same with an Edo period samurai. He probably wouldn't own just one sword. He probably owned multiple swords. So, just try to keep that in mind. He might have a particular sword that he uses that has a specific blade geometry for when he's fighting in armor, when he's expecting to fight people that are also wearing a whole lot of armor. He's probably got a different sword with a different sharpness and edge geometry that he's carrying around in civilian life when he doesn't expect to fight anybody in armor. And, he might have another edge geometry when he's unsure and he needs something kind of in between. Or he expects to run into a lot of people on the battlefield that aren't wearing armor, but some are, and he needs something that can deal with both situations. Now, I shot another video where I talked about how I believe that swords were extremely consumable items and they would frequently get damaged when they're actually used. And so, even if you take care to make the blade edge as robust as possible, you're still going to have a lot of damage and swords that are damaged beyond repair that need extensive repairs when they're actually used in a battlefield situation, regardless of that. And I tend to err on the side of sharpness because, if you think about cutting flesh, especially cutting flesh through even just fabric. Like if you've cut tatami before, here's a little thing I want to challenge you to do. Wrap some fabric around that tatami first. and then see what it's like cutting. And you'll find that, if your sword is not pretty dang sharp, that immediately increases the difficulty of cutting that tatami by a considerable amount. And that's important in a battlefield context, because if you're fighting, out of armor and, say, civilian violence of some kind, some guy's trying to rob you or whatever, or your rivals are trying to murder you, right? And you're defending yourself in that context, you want the sword to cause as much damage as it possibly can. And if you've got a sword that has a really robust edge that isn't going to be super slicey, and you lay it into that opponent and you cut them with a medium amount of force, say on the shoulder here, and that cut, because your sword isn't very sharp, it only makes a superficial wound and leaves some bruising that, the dude might need stitches from that the next day if he survives the rest of the fight, right? And then, that bruise is going to hurt for a couple of weeks. Whereas if the sword were significantly sharper, it might penetrate much deeper with the same amount of force. It might cut through a lot more muscle tissue and ligaments and blood vessels or even bone, and could be more likely to disable the opponent with the same amount of force. And you want every blow to cause the maximum amount of damage that you can. And you're not worried about if that sword is going to survive the fight. You're worried about if you are going to survive that fight. And so you're going to do everything you can to have an advantage. At least that's my opinion and how I see it. And I know other people will have a different opinion before. And like I reiterated in that other video, modern people have a penchant for fetishizing swords and kind of like worshiping these as like semi-sacred objects that we don't want to think of as being castaway or throwaway items. And to a certain extent, they're not either. They're, valued items that you care for, and they would have been in historical times too, but that's just like firearms, right? Like, I have firearms that I care for very much, and a soldier is going to very much care and take care of his firearm, but in the middle of a chaotic fight with artillery shells going off, it's quite possible that, your firearm's going to get damaged beyond repair or otherwise destroyed or lost. And armies are prepared for that. They've got a whole bunch of spare small arms ready to resupply their soldiers when that inevitably happens, because that's just part of things get torn up in violent, chaotic situations, and everybody's just prepared for that inevitability. So that's kind of just a reality of those circumstances that we don't think about in a modern context. So that's something that y'all should think about. Hey, sword nerds. So in this video, I talk a little bit about sharpening grinds and reference that to some historical ideas. And I bring forth one little theory I have about convex grinds, secondary bevels, that those convex secondary bevels are hard to perceive as a secondary bevel when you sharpen them. And if you have experience sharpening swords with a convex grind, you understand what I'm talking about. So I present that as a theory that I think that is the case for some historical swords when people say that they don't have a secondary bevel, that they really might have a secondary bevel. It's just not a super obvious secondary bevel because it's a convex grind. But that's just a casual theory, just a casual thought. I haven't invested a whole lot of serious research into that. But it does make me wonder, people that, the sword experts out there that have handled a bunch of antiques, how many of those people have actually, done a bunch of grinding of bevels on swords and stuff and, do that kind of stuff. I know, there's people like Peter Johnson and Todd of Todd's Workshop that certainly would understand all that kind of stuff. So, maybe I'm completely wrong about that, or maybe it has some merit for some swords. But anyway, I just wanted to throw in this little disclaimer that that's just a casual theory, even though I kind of present it as kind of a, a more authoritative thing when I'm talking about it. It's not really, it's just an idea I had. But I don't know, I think it's an interesting idea. All right, cheers.